Awesome.
Thank you. You're
Hello.
live.
Hi.
Hi. Okay, cool. Thanks for having me here. And yeah, so I want to talk about this concept that I've been referring to as ambient play. And I think for me, it kind of really got sparked by having kind of like a childhood where I grew up just watching a lot of screensavers. And that experience sort of got buried and forgotten over time. And then as I sort of had an education as a game designer, suddenly those experiences were unearthed again in the context of play and game development and the things I was learning about procedural art. And I kind of came to this realization about what I think is a really interesting thing that we all participate in, but maybe just don't talk about so much as a cohesive sort of thing that I kind of like to just put a little bit of a microscope on. So I'll get right into it. So first, a little bit about me and my work. I really like making procedural projects. I really like making systems that you can just kind of let them go and watch them do their thing for a while and be really surprised by the results of what can happen. And I really like experiences where you have very little choice. Although a lot of my work, I've kind of veered in a different direction and doing more sort of linear storytelling experiences like the game that I have in Amaze this year. But this is a different side of my work that I have gotten really, really interested in is the procedural stuff. So I mentioned screensavers at the beginning of the presentation. So I kind of want to show you this screensaver company that was a big influence on me when I was young. Sorry, my cat is on the computer. So this company is called After Dark, and essentially they just made huge packs of screensavers for Windows. And these screensavers were really widely varied in what they are, what they do. And I just think they're kind of amazing because while a lot of screensavers might have just like one interesting visual thing that is going on for a while, these ones were almost like full video games, but all they were missing was just the player. So you'd watch these really complicated systems. Some are narrative, some are visual, some are just otherwise. And I was just totally infatuated with them. And so like when my friends would come over, we would just sit in front of the computer and play different After Dark screensavers and like, you know, root for characters to win at fights, try to guess what would happen, all sorts of different things. So yeah, and then so a lot of time passed and I went to school for game design and I learned a lot about play. And I started remembering these experiences and then also kind of being able to connect them to something that I felt was much larger. So to kind of give you an idea of what it is that I'm thinking about here, if you've ever taken the time to sit under the stars and try and look for shooting stars, if you've ever played with the marble race, if you've ever made AIs fight each other in a fighting game, made a tournament out of it, if you've ever looked at a window and tried to guess which raindrop was going to fall to the bottom first, if you've ever watched sports or gone to the dog park to watch the dogs playing with each other, or gotten a divination reading, or watched a reality television show, then I think that you've engaged in what is an ambient play style. So what do I kind of mean by all that? This style really contradicts something that I think we think about play and we talk about play a lot, which is that choices are what make play interesting, that there's this dialogue between what the player is doing to the system and what the system is giving back as a result of those choices. But what happens in these circumstances is that we actually create a ton of meaning and we have a ton of investment in the results of systems that we have absolutely no influence over, no dialogue with, and yet we're still really, really invested in what's happening. And the systems don't even have to be very complicated to get us to engage this way. They can be the most simple example possible. So to give you a little example of just how simple they can be and still be engaging, I think a lot of people have had experience with the DVD menu logo, which bounces around the screen. And so this is an episode of The Office where they're all watching the DVD menu behind Michael. And what we know about this system is that there's one rare result, which is if the DVD menu square hits straight into the corner of the screen. And the only rules of the system is that the DVD menu is going to keep moving. It's going to bounce, change direction if it hits a wall, and that's it. But those two simple rules together create this one interesting result, which is the corner space. And just because of that, this whole room of people is deeply invested in this, what's happening, to the point where they're angry, where they're excited. And eventually, when it does happen, they all celebrate. And they're so happy with this result that none of them had any influence in doing that. They just leave the room and go on about their day. So that's an example of how it works. And I think a lot of us have experienced that in our daily lives. But yeah, this definitely conflicts with something that we think about play usually. But it has all the characteristics of what play is and what the magic circle is when we talk about that. So we talk about play as this kind of meaning creation, where we take things that normally wouldn't mean anything, like a ball and a goal, and suddenly it means everything to us in that space, in that moment. And we're still doing that same thing even when we have no influence on the outcome of the system. And I think that it's something that is actually really widely recognized in people. I think it's something that everyone has done and has played this way, but we haven't really talked about it much as its own thing. And I don't think there's a lot of conversation about how screensavers are kind of in the realm of game development. But at the same time, I also think it's not really a new thing. It's not really a new element of game design. If you're familiar with this ancient game, Senet, this is a game played by the Egyptians where they would simply roll, I don't think dice, but another device, and it would tell them how far they can advance on the board. And there's no choices to make. There's no strategy to it. You simply roll and you see what you're going to get. And they kind of use this to determine, who was in favor with the gods, but also more casually just to play. So maybe all this choice-based, skill-based game design is actually relatively more new. And then I also want to talk about the tradition of ambient art, since I am referring to these experiences as ambient. So ambience is something that exists across many art forms. It's in music, it's in film, and it's in games too. But what really unites it across those medium, and the reason why it can be in different medium and not just one, is that it's an engagement style. So it's how your brain interacts with whatever it is that you're experiencing. It's not necessarily just an aesthetic, right? So there are sort of aesthetics that get associated with, but you don't need to use certain instruments or certain sounds or certain elements in filmmaking to achieve ambience, as long as you are going for that engagement style. And games are all about engagement. So I think they have a very particular thing to contribute to ambient art. And I also really want to differentiate it from a particular set of aesthetics, because I think due to the nature of games, since we're combining engagement styles and aesthetics all the time, we sometimes get a little bit muddied or confused. So I see a lot of games out there advertising themselves as being ambient because they have like relaxing soundtrack, they have maybe like nice chill visuals. But the gameplay itself is actually like very, very active. It might be like a platformer or an action game where you're having to constantly make a ton of choices and be engaged in this more active flow state kind of way. And I just want to kind of separate that out, because I think the aesthetic elements aren't really what I'm trying to get at here, but that actual engagement style. So like a really loud, noisy, abrasive screensaver, I would argue is more my definition of ambient than like a nice chill platformer. And this is a quote from Brian Eno, which I think really ties nicely into procedural art and a lot of the programming that people are doing now. And he said this a while ago, I can't remember the year, but he was actually making like physical machines that would create music without human input. So kind of like programming before programming, just doing it with objects. But he says, since I've always preferred making plans to executing them, I've gravitated towards situations and systems that, once set into operation, could create music with little to or no intervention on my part. That is to say, I tend towards the role of the planner and programmer and then become audience to the results. So I think this just really nicely ties together the idea of ambience and other art and these sort of procedural things that we do in games. And often what we see is that these type of systems that we make are used to kind of add to or enrich larger games. They often fall into the background, whether they're weather or nature or otherwise systems. And as designers, if we understand how this play works in its isolation, like what makes it fun in isolation, then I think you can certainly use it to make your larger experiences that much better. But for me personally, I just really like looking at it on its own. And I think those experiences that are like screensavers that are purely spectative are really, really special. They're definitely a really different thing to design for. And I also think that the fact that we can play that way says a lot. And I'm really interested in investigating that. So I like to design for them on their own, but if you're a designer who makes larger experiences, then you can weave them in. So if you do want to design this type of play, if you're interested in it, I want to kind of go over some of the things that I've thought about in sort of trying to roll these ideas around in my head. So I originally kind of tried to think of it as like a linear thing where there was like games with a ton of choices and games with less. That very quickly didn't make sense. There's so many genres of games and so many axes on which they can kind of like invoke this sort of ambient headspace in us. So I kind of tried to pull it apart into different axes that can get us there. And I found these sort of three categories, and this is by no means like trying to be that prescriptive, but this is just sort of like sharing my thought work up to this point. So the things that I kind of identified that help people get into this headspace the most, one I call system autonomy. So that's like, if I put this down, if I don't touch it, if I don't do anything with it, will it still run? Will it just keep going without me? Will the systems, or do the rules of the systems, are they such that they can kind of go perpetually? And then there's unpredictability, which is just, you know, can I reasonably predict what's going to happen next? I think the less that you can predict what's going to happen next, arguably, the more you can get into this sort of play headspace with it. And then finally, there's the player's influence. So if you have a lot of influence on what can happen, I think it starts to veer into like other types of play. The less influence you have, the more you kind of enter this interesting headspace. So in finding these three axes, then I kind of tried to chart a lot of existing game types onto this. So we have this sort of unhinged graph here. So there's the three categories: system autonomy, unpredictability, and player's influence. So I grabbed some type of games like a team sport, like basketball, where you have to contend with the other players, but you do have, you know, a fair amount of influence on what's going on as an individual. There's a platformer like Mario where, you know, things aren't necessarily going to happen if you don't continue to play with it. And your influence on the outcomes is like kind of the utmost. And there's like something like a pet sim, which is interesting. I think part of what's interesting about this chart is that you can see like where things are really divided. You'd think like maybe a pet sim is a really ambient experience because it has pretty high system autonomy, pretty high unpredictability, but it also has really high players' influence on the outcomes. Pet sims are all about, you know, your care for your pet translating into the results of the game. And so the main point of me sort of creating a graph like this is to say that these things really aren't black and white. It's not like there's ambient play and then just everything else. Most of these systems are a really interesting blend of elements of ambience and elements of active engagement. And again, I kind of talked about how designers often weave these things together to create the experiences that they want. But in understanding these different axes, what I personally hope to do is to maybe really pull out what is ambient and put it under the spotlight and look at it on its own. So I think we do often make experiences that are trying to get towards ambient play. I don't think it's like something that people haven't been doing. There's a lot of procedural art out there. But I do think less often what happens is that we'll make these procedural tools or experiments, but what we don't talk about as much is like, what does it mean to be really invested in those and watching those and actually connecting it to other experiences like watching sports and realizing that all these things are in fact kind of this cohesive interaction style. And I don't think we often think about them in conversation with each other or what it means to create meaning from them. So that's kind of what I'm going to get into next. And I also think that that quote about becoming audience to the results, it really is something that happens for both the player and for the designer at the same time. So if you're just someone who's getting one of these systems, you can engage with it that way, but also while you're actually creating the thing as the designer of it, it's impossible not to also be engaging in that play style. Again, maybe even more so because the results of the system are like unfolding as you're designing them. And often you don't know how the things that you design are going to actually turn out when you start running it. So I really like designing in that space because of that, because you get to constantly be surprised by what it is you're making. It really feels like it takes on a life of its own. And kind of on the note of life, I have a Conway's Game of Life over here. But really what I want to highlight about what's so fun and interesting about designing in this way is that you often get the most interesting results out of the most simplest set of rules. So that DVD menu logo, again, it just moves in a path. And once it hits something, it goes in the opposite direction, suddenly turns into this large possibility space. Conway's Game of Life has that very simple set of rules where each tile is just going to check the tiles around it to see the number of alive and dead squares and then change its state accordingly. That's all that's going on. And yet you have, results like this, which almost look like actual like animals. One system that I worked on, I was really interested in this idea of dogs at play and their complex social behaviors. So I just made these simple AI. They have a view cone. If they see another dog in their view cone, then they'll do a greet behavior where they stand face to face with that dog. And that's it. And then when you set a bunch of them loose in a park together, they kind of have this nice little, it's almost like people at a party where little groups form and then they disperse and then other groups form. And it almost looks like a natural behavior. So yeah, simple rules, interesting results. So yeah, I think people make these systems a lot, but I think what maybe is less talked about is like what it means to engage with them or create meaning from them or play this way. So I kind of want to get into not just the fact that we do play this way, but like, how do we play this way? What do we actually do when we're engaging with these systems? So in thinking about them and also kind of my own experience, just enjoying them, I've kind of thought of a few different categories of how we play. There's this idea of like the golden result. This is a system where you just have one outcome that you're looking for. The other ones don't really matter so much. So like the DVD menu logo, there's also kind of related but different is my result, not yours. And you have your golden result, but there's also another special result that you really don't want to happen. Then there's divination or interpretation. This one's really interesting, which I think a lot of game designers have become increasingly interested in the past few years. But this is sort of a practice where you take the results of a complicated system and you connect them to some kind of element of the real world. So that could be your life or the life of the person getting the reading, or just the state of the world at large. There's narrative creation, where you take the results of a complicated system and apply them to a fictional setting. And then there's my favorite, which is just observing, where you really don't have a goal or a vested interest or something that you do with the results, but you're really just there because you just want to see something interesting happen and you want to see it in real time. I think something that I wanted to mention at the beginning is that procedural art's really interesting because these things are happening like live, like the code is being executed right before you. And I think when we know that, it's kind of really exciting. So how I see these styles interpreted in digital games a lot, the observer style, I think we see it in nature, nature simulations, sandboxes, screensavers, things where we just know that there's a large possibility space. There isn't necessarily a favored result. We just really want to see what happens. People have made a lot of interesting like plant growth simulations. The golden result, so gotcha, you have that one character you want to pull, the DVD menu logo, shiny Pokemon, they can only be shiny or not shiny, and you just want to get the shiny one. The narrative style, you see this a lot with like AI character simulations, with The Sims, with Pet Sims, with the game Tomodachi Life that I'll talk about in a little bit, but anywhere where you have a setting with characters and their behavior is going to be somewhat randomized. And then you kind of create a story out of that. My result, not yours. Gambling, rooting for a sports team against another sports team. And then divination and interpretation. This one translates really directly into just digital divination systems. But I do think video games and the digital space is a really great area for divination to kind of step into, because again, there's just so many possibilities when you're programming. All right, so I know I've kind of really blazed through a lot of ideas and information here. So I kind of want to bring it around to like, why talk about this? Because I do think, again, that it's something that is understood. Like, I don't think I'm coming up with a new concept, but I think like there's kind of this layer of like dust on it that I kind of want to blow off and like really shine a light on it and pull these systems out of just being used to add flavor to larger games. So I want to clarify what ambience and programmed art can mean. We're a relatively new medium, and I think ambience is well established in other mediums, but is kind of finding its footing here. So I really want to talk about what that can be and how special it can be in this medium. I want to bring focus to the interaction style that, while known of, hasn't been talked about in a cohesive way. So just connecting all those things that we may think are disparate, like the sky, like screensavers, like these real life things, and like these video game experiences that we have. I think we understand them separately, but I think actually talking about them as one thing is interesting. Also, talking about ambient play offers a broadened understanding of what play itself is. The fact that we can create meaning and create engagement in a system where we have no choice, I think really expands the definition of what play is from what we talk about. And so I think that's just really interesting for game scholars and just anyone to think about. And I also want to help artists design for this type of interaction. If this is something that you're interested in, or is just something that you want to add to existing projects, then I just want to say like, hey, I've been thinking about this for a while. Here are some of the things that I've come up with. I want to hear about your experiences and the things you've come up with, and just like have a dialogue with an artist who are interested in making this sort of thing, and kind of exploring it together. So on that kind of last note, I want to talk about some artists who have gone into this area, especially in digital games, because I think that they exist a lot outside digital games, but I see less things that are really advertising themselves as games that are designed like really for this style of engagement. So I want to highlight some of the ones that I have seen. Obviously, so After Dark, the screensavers, not really advertised as games, but I think they did this extremely well back in the 90s. And then here's some other digital games that enter the space well. So obviously Conway's Game of Life is more of an experiment than a game. David O'Reilly's Mountain was a mobile game with a sort of AI character and a weather system that you would come check on, and over long periods of time, different really interesting things would happen. Tomodachi Life is sort of a Sims-like funny experience with Nintendo, where you can create Miis of like your friends or of celebrities, and then they just have these crazy networks of interactions and social experiences with each other. And all you can really do is like check in on them. Seaman, really incredible, pet sim, but I think it's like much more than a pet sim. Nobi Boy has interactive elements, but a lot of what that game is these kind of great canvases of spaces with AIs in them who they all have interesting combinations of behavior when they meet each other, like this chicken riding on the tail. And also Endless Forest, where a lot of the unexpected nature that comes from the other players and the AIs that you can encounter in your journey. And then also this game, which was a part of a maze festival a couple years ago, or maybe last year, time is very confusing, but Brave Mouse Cartographer. This game, you are a mouse riding on the back of a large bird, and underneath you, the landscape just keeps going. You can't control the bird's flight at all. You can only try to map out the space underneath you as it goes. And so I kind of was in conversations with the developers about some of these ideas. And so it was really awesome to see some of the things I was talking about get implemented in the game that people ended up liking a lot. So definitely recommend checking this out if you haven't. And another artist that I really like who has done this stuff really well is Chang. He had a show up at MoMA for a while called Emissaries, and it is a AI space made in Unity with elemental systems and characters that interact with each other and combine. The piece was up 24/7 and it just ran constantly, and you could come watch it anytime. Of course, no run of the system would be like any other run. And I just think it's really cool to see this type of interaction style designed specifically for, made in Unity, which is, usually used as a game engine and then shown in like a really notable art museum. So definitely like the work that Ian is doing in this space a lot. And finally, kind of bringing it all home, I think talking about this opens up this interesting conversation about, what is play and what is the meaning that we make in it. Often we talk about play as the disambiguation and the mastery of systems. So it's like you come across a system that's very confusing, and then the more you play it, the more you understand and like you master it and you kind of dominate it and you get good at it. But we don't talk about as much like what it means to put that much stake into a system where like you can't get better at it, where something is totally beyond your control, and what the meaning of luck and the meaning of skill are. I think, most of the conversations I hear are just around gambling and how it's predatory, which it is. And, we don't want people to lose their lives to that sort of thing. But what about the types of play where, there's not real money at stake, and yet you still care like so deeply about what's going to happen? What does that mean to care that much about a system like that? And so, yeah, I just want designers to talk about that more. And I think this is the beginning of like a much deeper philosophical discussion that ranges even beyond the realms of games and play into just kind of greater facets of life. But I'm not going to go into that now. I'm just going to kind of leave it there as the tip of the iceberg. And yeah, that is all I have. Thanks for watching. I will certainly be in Discord to chat and answer any questions that people have. Thank you.
Thank you, Flan.
Thank you very much.
It's so cool, really. Thank you
Thanks.
for sharing this with us and also reaching out to talk about this, because I think it's super important. Do we have maybe it's a silly question, but do you have like a favorite ambient play that you like reach toward?
That's a good question. I mean, I do have to say everything in After Dark is pretty fantastic. Um, but I think one of my favorite ones in that was I think it was called like Out at the Park or something, and it was like a New York City park where there was all these different types of characters that could enter. Like there was a street performer, there were children, there were dogs, and then there were people like who would throw balls for dogs, and they would all come into one space together, and they all had like kind of combinations of interactions that they would have with each other based off of like what type they were. And so I really liked watching that one, and like just the fact that people besides the dog owner could pick up the dog's ball and throw it for the dog. And you know, people would crowd around the musicians and watch them. I really liked that, and then it was also kind of fun to see when I moved to New York that that is exactly kind of how it is in real life too. Yeah, I like that system.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. That it's the same in real life as well.
Mhm.
I really like the deeper thing what you were saying. It could be a very
Yeah.
good topic for next year's festival to really do something around that. Bring a group of people together and maybe writing a paper, something like, something like that.
Yeah.
Not a manifesto. This is something what we don't do, but maybe a kind of an open paper, a thought. What is written down a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Would be
Yeah, I would love
interesting.
to I would love to write more about it.
Yes, well, it was made on the spot, this idea, so
Yeah.
please help
It's
us,
I mean,
join us.
talks are there to be inspiring, right?
Yes, yeah. So
So
it's this
they
was very
also need
inspiring.
inspiration.
Yes, for
We
sure.
we need inspiration.
Yes.
You also nominated with Titanic, too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
congrats.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's very exciting. And yeah, I'll be talking more about that game on my open stream tomorrow. So definitely come by and talk about that. It's totally different than all the design stuff I was talking about in this presentation. But yeah.
But it's somehow connected, right? I mean, at least the last part of your
True. Yeah, I think
talk.
and like that conversation around having control or not having control, I think that is something that connects across them.
Yeah, excellent. So if you
Cool.
want to see more of Flan, there will do a open stream tomorrow. So check that out.
It's not tomorrow.
Sorry, on Monday. Yes, on
Monday.
Monday.
Right. Oh yeah,
Sorry.
it's
Yes,
tomorrow for me and the East
Yeah,
Coast time,
exactly.
but for all of
exactly.
you.
Oh, this time
yes,
confusion.
yes. Time zones. Anyway,
Yeah.
thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yes, talk to you later.
Bye, Flan.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.